All right, all right. So, welcome to anybody who's already on here for MSMB hosts. This is a project we have ongoing through MSMB, Martial Science Mactubicalis, where we're inviting teachers, we're inviting students, we're inviting participants and non-participants, and we're more than anything, we're really inviting inquiry and questioning. That's really the thing that we're trying to promote here. Um, in the past, we've had teachers from various different styles, and so I'm really excited today because we get to have Robert Hilliard from Kuno Martial Arts to come on here and spend some time with us, really talking about SILAT and giving us kind of an introduction or letting us dip our toe into that thing. One of the things that we really kind of point to is asking that teacher to share something that if they only had this small moment of time, if they only had a half hour, 45 minutes, and they wanted to impart something that they felt like was a real expression of their art, what would they do? For the person who had no experience of it, who really hadn't had any opportunity to participate in it, what would be the thing that they shared? And so, I'm always excited to see what people decide to share and how they decide to teach and how they decide to share it. And then on the other side of things, I'm always really excited to see what the questions are that come in and what people, want to know and want to understand and want to hear and want to learn. So make sure that as things are going on, whether during the demonstration or class portion of this thing, that you're asking your questions, and then afterwards when we do a sort of Q&A, that you put your questions up there. I have a lot of questions. I always have a lot of questions, so make sure you throw yours up here as well, and I'll make sure to include them. If you're watching on YouTube, there's a comment area, so whatever venue or whatever medium you're using, do that. And then the other thing is definitely this is participatory, so if you have the space in your home, he's teaching a short thing for you to actually be able to physicalize and be a participant in that regard as well. So make sure that you make some space, limber your body up, and then be prepared to move around. So I'll bring Guru Robert into here and say welcome to him and thank you for spending some time with us, definitely. And I will turn it over to you to just take on the rest of this for the next little while. So good to see you.
Thank you. First thing I want to do is thank Anjali for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to share what I teach and some of my knowledge in Pokulan, PENTJAK, SILAT, SEMANGAT, Baru. That is the full name, and I'll just start with that. Anjali said he wanted to kind of, he likes to see what people decide to talk about. And one of the things I like to talk about is the name. And really the name Pokulan really means to impact or to hit. This is a striking art. Although it is a complete art, we do have grappling, we do have groundwork, we do have locking, lots of sweeps and throws, but we initiate that. We do that by initiating the strike first. So that's the first thing I can talk about. Semangat Baru literally means new spirit. So we're teaching an ancient art or an old art with a new way, free of politics and things like that. And I'm the instructor in Kuno for Kuno Academy, New York City. Kuno just means ancient. So some people get confused when they say, Kuno Silat. That just means ancient. That is the name of the academy, but the name of the actual system is Semangat Baru. I usually teach in like 20-minute blocks. So, and the reason why I do that, because if I teach in a 20-minute block, it gives me about 10 minutes to answer any questions. So I'm going to give you just a short synopsis of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is the concept we are principle-based art. We don't usually say we have rules, although there are some rules. We like to focus on the principles. The very first principle or concept that I want to talk about is dimension division. I will then talk about another concept or principle called the guardian hand. Those of you who have studied with me or have seen the art know about the guardian hand. I'll talk a little about that, what it really means and how it can be applied. And then I'll talk about another really important aspect of the art, which is the principle of penetration, penetrating into the attack. We like to go into the heart of danger so we can utilize our tools. So the first thing I want to talk about is dimension division. And I want to let you know what those 3 dimensions are. The first dimension includes your head and your arms. Our hands, our arms, that's where we initiate our primary weapons. Of course, we can attack with the head. The head is usually a target of other people, so we include that as our first dimension. The second dimension is your torso. And your third dimension, I'm going to move back here. I have some markings on the ground, are your legs. And the first dimension, like I said, is really important because that's where you initiate the majority of the attacks. You're going to do that using your fists, your elbows, and things like that, grappling, locking, pulling. Sometimes we draw people in to attack them in a close range. If they're not into our fighting range, we like to pull those people in. We do have long range weapons, but we do like to, which are our legs, but we do like to initiate using our arms, our hands as our primary weapons. And of course, your long range weapons are your legs, right? For kicking and things like that. You can use those for trapping, sweeping, foot drags, and things like that. So when we talk about dimension division, the first thing that we like to do is show that we get the practitioners to understand dimension division through our forms, which we call jurus. And I'm going to initiate just the first form, just so you can see how we utilize only the first dimension in this particular form. So I'm going to step back here to my target so you can see most of my body here. And the first thing that I want to do is step forward. Okay, this is called jagaan, and this is the first posture that you learn, and then we initiate our juru from here. That would be juru satu, which is juru 1. So you'll notice that when I come here and I lean forward into this guarding position, I have penetration. I'm using my body and my center is aligned. My heels are in a line. I utilize only this first dimension for blocking, for striking with the elbow, for my hand strikes with this portion and this portion if I choose to, another strike, and then a downward block. So this is really important because you need to start to teach. When I teach people how to isolate that first dimension. A lot of people are confused when they see us move because it looks like we're moving everything at the same time. We are not. We typically block first, step in, and then attack. The reason why we block first is because we want to make sure that when an attack is coming, we are safe first before we move in. It also allows us to see if anything else is coming. So we want to block first. There is an old adage that we use, tool before the body. So you want to utilize your blocking tools before you move your body in. So when we say dimension division, the very first thing that we want to do is we want to utilize whatever blocking or mechanism that we use. It could be this kind of block. It could be this kind of block. It could be the block that you saw before. And that block, what we say when we do this in the form, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will block in this particular manner. The principle that we're trying to, or that we are imparting here, is that when you block past the shoulder, past the face. Because if you block here and it's not past your shoulder, you will still get hit. And if you don't block past your face, you're going to get hit in the face. The other part of dimension division is utilizing the torso. I'm not going to go into any of the other forms right now, but I want to also just emphasize that you use that. If a blow is coming towards your body, you can then shift off that center line and alleviate some of that pressure from that strike. And that's very important. So we do have angle and that's another principle in the art. So we'll talk about that perhaps in another demonstration. So dimension division. So the next thing I want to talk about is utilizing the dimension division concept to understand where your base is and where your center is. That's really important because when you're utilizing your throws, you need to know where that person's body is in conjunction with your body. And you want to make sure that things are aligned. And I usually tell my students, if somebody is in the center of your body, you move them to the center, you move them to the shoulder line. So one of the things that people remark when they see us move is when we come in, we don't do a lot of torso torquing when we strike. We usually lock that torso and we strike from there because we want to set up the next motion, which is a throw. And I use that, my body, as kind of the guidepost so that after I strike or I hit in this manner, I can move that person so where I can utilize my kicks or my sweeps. So the torso is really important because it helps us position the person for our takedowns, our throws, which allow us to finish them. And we usually finish with them on the ground, we hope. So that's the importance of this aspect here. The shoulder line is very important. Very important when you're utilizing your kicks because we kick to that shoulder line if the opponent is on the side. We don't want to be turning that because then we're changing the aspect of it. We like to think that we are training to deal with multiple opponents. So we figure that if there's an opponent here, there is an opponent here as well, or an opponent over here as well, or an opponent behind you as well. And you'll notice that as I turn, I utilize my shoulder line to guide that strike. Okay, so this is very important when you're talking about the aspects of the art. As you move, you strike, and as you position your opponent for your follow-up and finishing move. The other aspect of the art that is very, that some people get very confused with is our training stance, jagaan. So we're in this motion here. A lot of people think that this is our ready stance. One of the things that I like about this art is that we don't have any ready stance. So if I'm standing here, I'm ready. I can defend an attack. I can attack back from here. If I'm standing here, I can block from this angle. I don't need to get into any kind of posture. Jagaan is simply our training discipline, and it teaches our body how we, it teaches the proper posture for us to move in. So after I deal with the strike from this very natural position here, I deal with a strike, I hit, I move in, I adjust. So my jagaan position is simply my moving in, my movement to end in my fighting position. I fight from a very natural stance here. So a lot of people are confused, and I tell a lot of students, if they end up in this position here, this jagaan position, I'll turn to the side so you can see, typically what ends up happening is as you move in, your face will be positioned right where that person's hand is. So if you end up in this position, you better have something ready to defend yourself. We don't like to be in that position. We like to adjust and stand pretty much straight up. And I can talk about the foot position in another segment later on. The next principle I really want to talk about is the center. And the center guides our strikes. It tells us where we need to defend. It also tells us that we need to, where we need to reposition. This is also, most important things, striking areas are typically in the center of your body. So we be very mindful that we need to shift off that line at times, reposition ourselves, reposition our shoulder line if we need to alleviate that. We still have weapons that we could use from this position. Again, I showed you that kick. We can also do that from here. So the shoulder and the center line is very, very important. So we want to make sure, and the training is very regimented and systematic, but we want to make sure that we recognize these areas when we are training, when we're using or expressing the form, our juru. We have that position established. And you notice my strikes are to the center. We do have a center line theory that is kind of complicated. I don't want to talk about that today, but it's just a teaser for maybe a future conversation or some questions later on. The last concept that I really want to just talk about briefly is the guardian hand concept. So the guardian hand concept is really, as practitioners of SILAT, we assume that we are smaller, weaker than the person that's attacking us. So we always want to make sure that we have a backup with us. So, and the guardian hand is our backup. So usually, and I say usually, 99% of the time, when you see one strike or a block or a motion like this, like you saw before, or even if I throw this elbow here to my shoulder line, my base, as you see, I have a hand that is positioned nearby. Sometimes it is at the wrist, many times it is. We utilize that for blocking as well. But it's also used as our backup. So if someone throws a punch, it's coming straight here, and I block it in this manner. If I mistime it, I can pick it up with this hand. That's really important. We always want to bring a backup. We never want to think. In some SILAT systems, they call this hand the respect hand. You want to respect your opponent. So when they throw a punch, you make sure you have this hand here to cover if you mistime. If they prove to be stronger than you expected, it is your backup. We also can use the guardian hand as a brace for our block. Perhaps that person, you're worried that that person is going to overwhelm you with their power. We don't think that you don't think that you could block it with just one hand. You can use this hand to brace and utilize the power of the secondary guardian hand to help you. Now you notice one of the things that we try to emphasize in the art when we block is that we're blocking this entire area. You're covering this entire area. When you parry, we're making sure that you're blocking just past your shoulder, just past your face, as I mentioned before, completely. So we don't just stop once we make contact. We want to block through, just like when we punch, we want to punch through the target in all instances. So the guardian hand is really important. Sometimes you will see it very close to the wrist. Sometimes you'll see it in other. So for example, when I do this, you'll see my guardian hand is here. It's not by the wrist, but it is my backup in case I need to use it. In case I need to use this to stuff that person. And also I can use this here and then replace it with my other hand, which makes this now the guardian hand. So you'll see that every time we move, when we free play, the guardian hand is always there. We do any of our motions from any of our other jurus, you'll see that the guardian hand is there. So it's really important to express SILAT, our version of SILAT, in this manner, because these principles are what builds the system. I usually tell my students when I see them blocking without the guardian hand, I usually say this isn't the Matrix. Only Neo can block like that. We have to make sure that we are utilizing our guardian hand as we move and as we play SILAT even in our expression, our Kembangan flower dance, because we want to make sure that we're using the guiding principles of this art. So that's just a brief introduction to some of the things, or some of the way that I teach, and some of the very, very basic concepts that I would teach a beginner. And I'd like to see if you have any questions.
Yeah, so much. I mean, I always have a lot of questions. You've seen that in class, you've seen that across the board. I always have a ton of questions. So I would love to get into some of the technical questions, but maybe save them towards the end, and then maybe ask you some more like insight SILAT questions in a broader sense, if that's all right first.
Sure.
So obviously my first question is just going to be how you came to SILAT, because you had martial arts experience of varying types before that, and so SILAT was a very particular choice for you. So I'm kind of curious about how you came there.
I came from I have two brothers that were practitioners of Okinawan karate. And so I always say that they were my first teachers, which really means that they would bring me and my other brother to the backyard and slap us around for for about 20 minutes and go, okay, now do this, right? So
that's those authentic teaching. That's authentic style, yeah.
Because we were the ukes, right? So it's like, yeah, come at me, and then they would do their thing, and then they would say, okay, as our reward, they would show us something. And so they were really my first teachers. But then one of my brothers had a friend that was had a kung fu school, and it was Northern Shaolin, and that he sent me to. And I was there for about 2 or 3 years, and I won a lot of tournaments. And as you know, tournaments are not street fighting. So that kind of whet my appetite for martial arts. I had a break when I went to college, but when I came back, I ran into a buddy, and he introduced me to Wing Chun, and I wanted to learn that, and because it was, it's the martial art of Bruce Lee, so who doesn't want to learn Wing Chun, right?
Yeah, doesn't.
So I got into that, and I was there for, I was an instructor there for, I trained there for and taught there for a combination of about 11 years. And during that time, that was in the 90s, I had a friend who was a close friend of mine who's since passed away, introduced me to a mutual friend from the neighborhood who was in the military. And he had been, he was like, you gotta see this art. It's called PENTJAK SILAT. I had no idea what it was. And that was in like the early 90s. And my friend showed me a couple of moves. He showed me sempak, dempak, things like that. And I was amazed because I couldn't do those things at the time. And then he introduced me to our friend Zach Jenkins, who then started showing us. So he was in the military, so he would come in and do a workshop. He's also an escrimador, very, very skilled escrimador, and he would show us a couple things. And like anytime you go to a workshop, I left with like one thing, right? They show you like 50 things, you leave with one. So I could do
sometimes if you even have that. Yeah.
So the thing I left with was pura kepala, and so I could do pura kepala. And then he did another workshop, maybe like a year or two later, and I picked up the figure 4 arm lock and throw. And the thing that really got me to really appreciate PENTJAK SILAT, and particularly this system, was that anytime there was an attack, there was an answer. And I had been with teachers, and every question was valid. I had been with teachers before where I would say, you would ask a question, they go, "Oh, that's just stupid. That doesn't work. We don't have that. That's nonsense." And so I didn't experience that with SILAT. with this particular, brand of SILAT, or I should say style. And I thought that really drew me. It had a lot of and it was complete. It had weapons in it. It had grappling. It had, sweeps that worked. I was other systems where you utilize a sweep and it didn't work. I
mean, I will say, I want to interject there just to say that one of the things that has been really interesting to me when you say sweeps that work has to do with it has a teaching methodology that's very clear.
Yes.
And maybe we can get into that more later, but that is something that I've noticed already, that I've been like, oh, okay, if it's teaching a sweep, it's very particular about how to make that work effectively.
Yeah. And it was always it was never do this and they'll fall down. You have to know where their body is positioned. You have to know where to put their body in position to your body and your shoulder line, and how to utilize the tools that you have available to you. And that was really important because, when you have that, that you have that mystical thought about your teacher, and your teacher, tells you, well, that don't work. You start to believe that don't work. Right. There's this art for me answered a lot of questions that I had. And I didn't experience, teachers in this art that said, oh, other systems are not good because they don't do what we do. I didn't experience that at all.
Yeah. I mean, how would you differentiate this SILAT? And, we'll go more into this lineage in particular, but I am kind of curious about ways in which you would differentiate this type of SILAT from maybe SILAT that other people have seen or been exposed to. Not that everyone, and I would say in the US, SILAT isn't a predominant style of martial art that everyone has seen. It has become a little bit more popularized through some movies and stuff like that, but there are definitely some styles that you see more often than others. And so I'm kind of curious, how would you differentiate this from other ones?
There's a lot of what a lot of people forget when they talk about SILAT, or they have discussions or they see SILAT. SILAT is very region specific. There's a lot of islands in Indonesia. There's a lot of, and sometimes the ground may be wet. So, for example, when I was learning another SILAT from a teacher I learned from very, very briefly, he had mentioned to me, in a lot of places, the ground is wet, and, they realize that if they're standing up, they're going to end on the ground. So they start very low to the ground. So it's very region specific. We are a striking art, so we are more of a stand-up art. You'll find some SILAT that has a lot more kunci, locking, or more grappling, or low to the ground. You'll see some SILAT that has seated jurus. We don't have the seated jurus in this art. I was told by Pendekar Mariano Oang, who has since passed away, that one of the reasons why that they had the seated jurus, some of these arts, was when the Dutch were occupying Indonesia, and they banned SILAT, but they didn't ban reading of the Quran. So they would read the Quran in a bench across from each other. Right. And when people would walk by, they would put the Quran down and they would practice. And so that was one of the,
Never even heard of that. That's like a little mind-blowing tidbit right there.
That was one of the stories that he told me. And so he goes, though, and he in his and he would show us, he's like, some SILAT, you have the seated jurus. We don't have that in this art. And so that's, it has a lot to do. The thing that really drew me to this art was the Indonesian martial arts. They're very adaptive, and you'll see, you may even see, not in our art, but in other versions of SILAT, other SILAT styles, you may see some of the Japanese influence in there. You may see some of the Chinese influence in there. So they are very good at adapting to things that they see, and to the terrain, to experiences that come to them. So that was, and I always kept that story with him with the seated jurus, and I was like, it made a lot of sense, very practical.
Cool. I mean, I have a few questions that have already popped up, but I'm going to hold them to the part where we're talking a little bit about some of the technical aspects, because I did want to, even before we jump in that, still talk a little bit more about this lineage of SILAT that you're doing, all the way from Serak, Bukti Negara, SEMANGAT Baru, as them all the same, and also differentiating. And then also maybe you want to talk a little bit about Pendekar, and him and his legacy, and the teachers who he left kind of behind.
Well, okay, so this is, you're right on the money with that. So this is from West Java, and it is Serak is the main, the lineage of this art. And from what I was told, that Johan de Vries, who is a Dutch Catholic missionary, had gone to Indonesia to evangelize, and he came across the Badui people who are very secretive, and he in his quest to evangelize them, actually became a part of them, and grew to love them, and became very trusted and respected by them. And they showed him Selah. He in turn, he had married an Indonesian woman, and in turn showed this to his family. And over time, this became the system that, that the family would teach to each other. Pendekar Paul DeThouars was in that lineage. And he came to the United States. I guess sometime in the 80s. I'm not 100% sure of the time frame. It may have even been before that. And he created Bukti Negara as his expression of the art that he was taught. And my teachers come from that lineage. And over time, just before Pendekar passed away, they decided that they were going to call our art SEMANGAT Baru, which is a new spirit. New spirit, meaning it is the same art, but it's free of any politics, more accepting than a lot of other, sometimes you have people that, they may not want to have people ask questions about other martial arts while they're in a class. We don't do that. It's like, bring all questions. We accept all people. We wanted to have that spirit. So it is directly in that lineage of Pendekar Paul DeThouars. In Kuno Academy, the head Mahaguru is Danny Habricks, who is the head of our system. And we all go through that lineage and that line.
So 2 questions that brings up. One is, I remember at a conversation in the past, you talking a little bit about the decision to develop this Bukti Negara as a way of sort of partitioning a little bit away from like the family system of Serak, and maybe there's some expansion you can do on that. And then also maybe just talking a little bit about Pendekar and who he was as a person, as a teacher, all of that stuff, I mean, he's a famous person in SILAT. He is a famous person in SILAT, like across the board. He's one of those people in SILAT who no one doubts if he can fight. What I mean? Yeah. Across the board, he's not just kind of doing motions and blah, blah, blah. Like he's, pretty acknowledged as a fighter. But he seems like an interesting character, interesting person overall, too.
Yeah, Pendekar has passed away, but I can tell you what I was, what I know, about why this came to be. From what I understood and understand is that part of the issue was that he wanted to create a system that was accessible and how should I say it, that people could learn and not be frustrated right away. Because traditionally, and I try to teach the same exact way that my teacher, taught me. There is no rush to learn, SILAT. There is a certain aspect of respect and conduct that needs to come into it. And a lot of people don't have the, what I believe is he saw that a lot of people didn't have the patience to learn in the way that he was taught. So he wanted to create a way, and it's certainly not a shortcut, because this is a hard art to really to get into. It's very challenging, but very rewarding. But he wanted to teach it in a way that had all the aspects of the parent system, but would incorporate them maybe a little bit faster. So when we talk about the parent system, I think there are 18 jurus. In Sarak, we have 8. But in those 8 jurus, we incorporate the majority of those motions that you will see in 18 of those jurus. And so that is one of the reasons why. He's not here for me to question. I can also, but that's what I learned about the system. And through talking to my teachers and watching old videos of Penn Deckers and things like that. I think the second part of your question was a little bit about him.
Yeah, him as a person, him in the world, him as a teacher, as a person, as a character.
To be honest, this is a funny thing. I never trained with him. I trained with his instructors, but I did speak to him on the phone. He's a very no-nonsense person, and very practical, down to earth. One of the things that, and the funny thing is, his spirit lives on through his teachers, because the way they teach is how he taught. The way I teach is how I was taught. So we want to make sure we keep that. I don't add things to the system, even though I know other martial arts. So he was a very practical person. This is about fighting. And one of the funniest stories I've ever heard about him, my teacher told me that they were doing, he was teaching a class, and he asked a very simple question, why do you learn martial arts? And he got a lot of philosophical questions, to be at one with your mind, body, and spirit. All that may be true for some people, to understand myself better, all these things. And he said, he was like, wrong. And he goes, you learn martial arts to fight better. that was it. And so that pretty much sums him up in a nutshell from what I know of the man and his character.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that always stands out to me is that he is a person who had a limited academic education. So, and I really specify that I'm talking about academic education, not world education or life education and life learning. But he had a limited academic education, but the level of organization around teaching and the systemization of teaching methodology, to me, seems really profound. Like, it really influences me in other things that I teach as well. And so that's something I would be curious, is that something that came from him? Is that something that came from his students after and wanting to organize the system? Like, where did that come from?
That I don't know. I do know that SILAT in general is very systematic. But but I believe that happened afterward. From what I was told, it happened afterward, because he was taught, like in many family systems, it's like, today we're doing this, right? So you do whatever your teacher tells you. I think that later on, when he came, to the United States, and when he was putting Bukti Negara together, which we now call SEMANGAT Baru, he organized it in a way that it would be easier to learn. So, and that, and I don't want to get into a bunch of other stuff, but you're a very intellectual person. there are many different types of intelligences, right? So we, of course, we always think that schooling, even though school is really important, is the only way that you can learn stuff. You can learn things and apply many different types of knowledge. And so, limited schooling, but, really educated, right? So, and so he put the system together in a way that it could be, systematically learned, and it has been refined over the years, with him and his students, his instructors. They've refined it and fine-tuned it. So now we have a very specific curriculum that teachers like myself can look at and say, okay, by a year, you should know this. In 2 years, you should know this. In 6 months, you should know this. So that it is, systematic, and where you are in the pecking order of that art. And I do that with my students. Like, I know, which students know the first two jurus, and, know the first two sambuts. They know, this strike and this throw, and they know how to express these techniques. So it's evolved over time. And I believe that was, his doing with, in conjunction with working with his instructors and looking at the system.
Yeah. So I did want to jump into some of the kind of more technical questions, some of which are things that you brought up while you were doing that little demonstration, while you were expressing a little bit of things that you thought were of importance, and some of them that are kind of broad questions or coming in from other friends and stuff. One of them was just the idea of the bass. I remember thinking it was really interesting that in most arts, when we talk about the bass, we are talking about the waist and down. We're talking about the legs. And when you talk about the bass, you were talking about the framing and the upper body. And why is it that we use that language differently? Or was that your experience as well, like having to change your thought around what is the bass?
Your base is still your leg. I mean, if you still express that, but we're talking about this base in terms of angle, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So, which is why we're not constantly shifting this, because if I want to throw somebody and they're here, if I shift, well, that changes the whole dynamic. I have to do something different. So if I'm in this position, that person's in front of me, my base here, my base angle, this is set. So I know that if they're here, I can move them to this position and I can execute my sapu and they will go in that direction. So we want to make sure that certainly your base are your legs, right? But when we're talking about in terms of angle, this is your base here, your shoulder line. Okay.
Okay. And does that also then play into, and I know you mentioned before, maybe taking an opportunity to expand on how your concept of center line might be different from what most people vision as like what center line means.
Yeah, your center, we can spend hours.
Yeah, and I've been in classes where it's like this winding maze rabbit hole of people trying to figure out how to explain what centerline means.
Yeah.
So give your best shot.
How I like to express it or explain it is like I'm standing, I'm straight right here. So my center is here, right? You're attacking me to my center, right? If I were to parry that and strike, I'm striking you to my center, right? Simple. But if you strike my center and I move it, right? And I strike from my center, that's my new center. Make sense?
Right.
So they're going to be striking to your center where they perceive your center is. Your goal is to alleviate that and strike to your new center. That's a very basic way to talk about that, right? It goes everywhere, right? You move here, your center is now here. It's now back here. It's now back here. So you always need to realize that there is a center coming from, where that person is attacking and where you attack from. You're certainly not going to stand here when that person's attacking you and try to block that. You know that I always say angle first when you're blocking, right? Because if you try to block in that straight position, you may mistime that. He may you may block it, and he may crash right through. You're accepting that power. But once you alleviate that, you can then strike to your new center. So that confuses a lot, which is why I said before, we don't do a lot of this, right? Because when you're doing this, you're changing that attack point every single time.
Yeah. So and that's the thing that we've had to address a little bit, because a lot of my reference for striking has been boxing, and or even within my Filipino martial arts, it has a strong like boxing reference in terms of body mechanics, which is a lot of turning the torso and thus changing what my center line is. And it sounds like what's being expressed here is the idea that we both have a center line, and I don't need to make mine correspond with yours. In fact, move separately from that. But it also speaks to why you choose to, as a striking format, you're using a lot of chain punching as opposed to boxing mechanic or Western boxing mechanic striking.
Yeah. We don't, you won't see these, you'll see some uppercuts, yes, but you won't see this kind of strike. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I'm not saying you can't do it. What happens is, we train a certain way, but when you fight, everything you learned is going to come out, right? You know that. If you train in this system, but you were a boxer before, and you go, you throw that hook punch and you knock somebody out, I'm not going to say, well, that was a poor execution of SILAT technique, right? It worked for you. But the bottom line is, we use our center as our reference, because we want to make sure that, well, first of all, it's constant, right? It's consistent. It doesn't, this part of your body is always this part of, you're not going to wake up one morning, it's going to be over here, right? If you do, you have a problem. It's here. And so, that is your reference, right? You strike to that point. Doesn't mean you can't hit other points in that person's body, but it is coming from that angle, from that center. We do strike over here, and you see me using my shoulder line for that reference point as well. So, those are some of our, our two main reference points for striking. Doesn't mean we can't alter that and hit in a different direction, but it makes things a lot simpler when you know that it's coming from here or it's coming from here, which is really important. And we'll talk about Lanka another time. When you have those patterns, the Lanka on the ground, those, the Tiga or Sukorum, and you're looking at that because that is where you're positioning your body for that strike. It's your training tool as well. It's not just ritualistic.
Right on. So we got a couple of guys on, Kyle and Earl, who you've met before, who train some SILAT, and Guru Francis, who teaches Kali and teaches Filipino martial arts. So I'll be like kind of weaving their questions in as we go along and everything too. One of the things that came up from Earl was asking about a thing that has proven challenging for you in your practice of SILAT. So what is a thing that you constantly are like, still working on that's challenging?
Everything.
And maybe also something that was challenging for you before when you first started, that has, now that you're like, oh, okay, I've worked it out,
We've had this, those sweeps from those, the sweep to the kick in Juru 6. I found that to be really, some of the kicks that we utilize in the system, they come at odd angles. You may be twisting and looking behind you and kicking in that direction. I found those kicks very, very challenging. They're very difficult to execute if you're not familiar with them. And I was not familiar with them. I had never experienced kicks like that before. And so that was really challenging. And the best way that I found to, and I tell my students this, if you're doing a Juru, or one part of the Juru is challenging, isolate that one part and practice that part by itself over and over and over again, always on both sides. And then reincorporate it back in the sequence. And that's how I got over a lot of things. When I first, this is a very unique art. So I struggled with everything in the very beginning. I never did forms like this before, strikes like this before, elbows like this before. I just found it to be, we have a saying, we make the unusual usual. So for me, it was all very challenging. And then, but the way, that you get over that is you practice really hard. And one of the things that has worked for me was just to isolate the most difficult part of that, work on it, of course, train everything, then isolate that particular difficult part and then put it back in there.
Yeah.
And challenge yourself, say, I want to be able to do this, maybe you can't do it once perfectly. I want to be able to do it once perfectly, then twice, then 4 times, then 8 times, and then, when you can do it nearly every single time without making a mistake or falling, which in my case with the kicks, then, you're ready to move on.
Yeah.
But still practice that thing.
yeah, but still practice that thing. And even if it seems like the most minute, simple things, spend a lot of time practicing it, which is a thing for me always to remind, like it could be the smallest thing, like over and again. You've told this story before about spending a whole class where the person was like, I just want you to step into jagaan over and over and over again. Like just stand in the beginning of the lanka, step into jagaan and be like, okay, again.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah.
I was with my teacher, and he wanted to see, let me see your jurus, and I spent probably a half an hour just stepping into jagan because it was wrong, and he was like, again, again, until I could do it properly. And that's really important. That repetition is really important. We want to make sure that we are precise, because, that little increment, means a lot,
Yeah. Can I got a couple of questions up here. I'm going to ask mine, and then I'm going to throw those in there too, right after that. So don't worry, I'm going to definitely get your question in there. But I did want to ask a little bit about kabangan and just your thoughts about that. So in some systems of SILAT, it's a more formalized thing, like there's very particular kabangan. There's also the element of, if you were to see a film that SILAT is in, that's the part that obviously people are very excited about because it's this part that is attached to the fighting of the thing, but is also very expressive of an individual aspect and a cultural aspect in it as well. Yeah, kabangan is an interesting thing that is kind of abstract. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Kabangan is the flower dance. That's what it means. And it is the expression of your learning, right? So it's the expression of your movement. It's the flower of your movement. So it is your learning, your jurus, your sambuts, your, lanka, your sweeping, your all the things that in free form. So you can do it. It's like, for lack of a better analogy, shadow boxing, right? So it's akin to that. I've taught it several ways. Sometimes when I have had students that were really struggling to understand, I'd say, okay, do this motion, now this motion, now this motion, not in sequence. These would be motions that were coming to, improvised by me, but put in a sequence so that they could follow. And then from that, it allowed them to kind of, for lack of, analogy, blossom, so they can create their own freeform Kembangan. It should be the expression of your learning, your movement. And not everybody is going to do it exactly the same. Just like, even though, everybody learns the jurus exactly the same, when we fight, it's going to be different. Maybe you're more aggressive. Maybe you're more passive. Maybe you're more defensive. Maybe you're more offensive. That will come out, your expression. Maybe you like elbows more than you like punching. Maybe you like kicking more than you like, elbows. So that's going to be your expression of fighting. So Kembangan should be an expression of your learning with regards to, the material that you've been exposed to.
Right. In the past couple of conversation I've had and some that I've even heard with other people, we've been talking a lot about culture as it relates to a martial arts practice. And Kyle, I'm sorry, brought up this question about elements of Indonesian culture that particularly you felt connected to, or that you felt like you had a relationship with. I know that you actually have spent some time, like investigating that thing. And so that would be interesting to me to learn. And also, there's the element of Penn Deckers was kind of, he was a pragmatist in a lot of regards. So whereas there are some styles of Silat that are only practiced among certain communities, or only by Muslims, or only by, this particular region, Pendekar was a different person in that regard. So both, I'm curious about, the importance that you might place, or non-importance, with connectivity to culture and training Silat, and also your thoughts about Pendekar and the way that he kind of viewed Silat in those regards.
So, as far as culture goes, I like to think that, I like to respect the culture that the art comes from, right? So this is, this culture, this art is from Indonesia. And I like to, especially when it comes to how it is taught, I try not to deviate to adat and hormat, or respect and your code of conduct in class are huge for me. And so we want to show respect to ourselves, to the people that taught the art, who learned the art, who brought the art over, who are in class with us, people that come in to just watch. Respect is huge. And I always found that when I was with any Silat teacher, that they, always emphasize that. And, the adat, the conduct, and it really stuck with me. If you're come in my house, which you haven't been, which I'm inviting you to when this is all over, you'll see I have Indonesian masks in my house and shadow puppets. I always found that to be because, I think that although when I was growing up, I knew of Indonesia, I didn't really experience any of the culture until I started learning Silat. So my learning, about the culture came through Silat, and that's usually my point of reference. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, definitely. But also I was kind of curious, in terms of Pendekar, that what I've noticed, and maybe I'm wrong in thinking this, but he is definitely like, there's no magic here. Like, this is like science. Like, this is bodies and science and very pragmatic thinking. And that's something that also is very interesting.
Yeah, it's true. There are some people, and I don't know, because I don't get into people. I'm not a mind reader, but I do know that sometimes when I get people that come in to learn, I think they're a little bit put off by the fact that we don't talk about ilmu from a magical standpoint. We don't do that. We talk about, fighting, right? How to put somebody down. I've studied with other people. They talked about, it's with the spirit, and we don't really have that kind of spiritual stuff in the art. At least my training has not, and my teachers do not emphasize that at all. It's all about, how does this apply to combat? And that is it. So your spiritual practice in the art is your own spiritual practice that you keep. From training with me, I don't get into any of that. And I suspect that there are some people that have come in that may have been put off by that. It's like, this is not what they expected. They expected, incense to be burning and this, that, and the other thing. And, we don't really do that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that, because that is an interesting thing that is a differentiating factor, that there are, like you said, probably thousands of styles of SILAT. If we were to go into every family system, every like regional or tribal system and across the board, and that they are different from each other. And that means not only in their physicalization, but in their ideology as well, that goes into them. So that all those things change. I have a couple more questions I definitely wanted to throw your way. One comes from Matas Negro Francis, who is out here, and hopefully you'll have the opportunity to meet him. He's a good friend and a peer and a teacher out this way. And he just asked about, in really short form, and you kind of spoke to this a little bit before, but if somebody was just to say, what is SILAT? It seems like the biggest thing, but you would think about like, what is my elevator response, right? Like I'm going. What's my elevator response? Like, what is SILAT?
It's an Indonesian system of fighting, and it could be broken. You can look at it from two aspects. There is sometimes a sport aspect called olahraga, and there is a self-defense aspect called bela diri. The system that I teach is bela diri. We don't do sport. We're about, defending yourself in the street. So it's Indonesian self-defense. And that's the simplest, trapped in the elevator for 30 seconds response I can give you.
That's how you do it. Yeah. Cool. I do also have this other question, though, that this kind of brought up from me, because he was asking about maintenance, and you talked a little bit about that before. You talked about some of the differences between styles of SILAT based on the region from which they came. So then there also has to be a question about the place in which it exists, right? And so for us as people who are practicing SILAT in a culture of people who have a huge array of access to martial arts, a huge array, right? Like we're learning SILAT as a self-defense system in a form where people are training BJJ, where people are doing mixed martial arts, where people are doing, Taekwondo and Kali and blah, blah, blah. How do you think that this fits into that world? How does it, accommodate for the fact that there are people who will take some hits and come in and then just pull you down onto the ground, or people whose first thought is to pull out a weapon because like that's what they're practicing, or how does this fit into this ancient thing fit into this new context?
That's a great question. One of the things that I like is that I'm echoing a little bit is that it has an answer for those things. We have, techniques that are specifically for people trying to grapple you, or defenses against weapons. But what I always tell people is when they train a system, know how to defend yourself if you find yourself in that situation, but also know where your wheelhouse is, right? So, and a lot of times I've seen people fight, they try to box with a boxer and you're going to lose. Right? I'm not going to grapple with a grappler, you're going to lose. And I tell my folks, all the time, we train hard so that, we can defend ourselves if we have to defend ourselves. The first thing that I always try to tell people to do, if you find yourself in a situation where you think that there's going to be violence, try to get away from the violence. That's the first thing. That's the
best
first
self-defense.
Yeah. I say your first line is self-defense is your wallet. Here you go.
Right.
And I tell people, hey, maybe you can talk away, but you defend yourself with extreme prejudice, right? So you want to, when you do it for real. And one of the reasons why we don't have ready stances because we don't want to give anything away. One of the things that I loved about this system is the element of surprise. If you see me on the street and you attack me, I don't look like I can fight, and that is, I want to utilize that to my advantage. So, somebody pulls a gun out, comply, right? Somebody pulls a knife out, comply. But know that if your last resort is to defend yourself, you have some tools available to you to do so. That's, and listen, and I remember when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu became really popular back in the 90s when they were, the UFC first really started to gain speed and gain some steam, and people were like leaving all these systems, and that's fine, and learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I think is a great art. I think, I was reading an article and this guy said, everybody wants to talk about what style is better than the other style. He goes, all I care about is who won the fight. And that put it into perspective because I can tell you for a fact that there's some street fighters out there that could really put it on 90% of martial artists out there,
Right. Yeah, very, very much the case.
Yeah.
I had two things. Well, one thing was that Guru Francis was also asking about, and I hadn't heard this before. He was saying Belladiri, isn't that a system where you consider narrow passageways, like narrow areas to operate in? Is there some old association between those two things for some reason that I hadn't heard of before?
Not to my knowledge. Belladiri to me, it literally means self-shield. It just means self-defense. However, there are tons of training methodologies out there where you can utilize that, and they probably do. It's like, look, this is your, one of the reasons why we fight. We call it our hang loose distance. We fight very close in, as because we don't anticipate or don't expect there to be a lot of space all the time. So I can certainly see why he would say that. But Belladiri literally means just self-shield. It's just self-defense. If that aspect in that training methodology includes tight spaces, sure, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that definitely drew me to training with you and spending time in your system was that, again, SILAT is vast and various and varied. But yours is very particular to this close range, and the style in Filipino martial arts that I spend the most time with, Pikiti Tirsha Kali, is very focused on what we would call long range, short range, right? Like we can operate in long range and then we bridge to close range so that we can develop control and operate very efficiently. We're in the close range, and close range is the scariest. I mean, truth be told, like, why did I want to spend a lot of time there? Because that is the range that's really scary to me. Like, to be close to someone while they're holding a blade, where they don't really have to know what they're doing in order to hurt you, was a range that I was like, I need to spend a lot of time there, and I need to develop a practice there. And so it seemed like a nice bridging or corresponding art to be working with you guys who, first of all, talk about that element of penetration, so moving from a range into a closer range, and then how to maintain that range and have a lot of options once you get there. So that was really interesting to me for working with you guys.
Yeah.
Another thing that I did want to ask about, and this was interesting. He was saying that there was a reference that he had that really had to do with footwork, and that's why he had this association with that kind of close quarters or narrow passageways idea there. But one of the things I did want to ask you, because again, I am spending a lot of time nowadays, particularly in Filipino martial arts, and they start a lot with weapons. Depending on the style of SILAT, some place more emphasis on that and some place less. Some place a lot of influence, a lot of importance on the straight blade, whereas some use karambit. Some place a lot of focus on use of sarong. Some are, like you said, a lot of ground fighting, a lot of this or a lot of that. Are there weapon elements within SEMANGAT Baru? Where do you feel like it makes opportunity to practice those things to make sure its practitioners are adept in those regards? And then maybe where there's some spaces where you could do more, like where there are places where you're like, oh, we could actually do more to increase this aspect of our art or this other aspect.
One thing for me to see a lot was the fact that when I was learning Kung Fu, you learned one form, when you were empty hand, and you learned a completely different form when you put a weapon in your hand. With SILAT, you don't have that. The movements that you learn in your jirus are the movements that you utilize with the karambat, with the knife, with pisau. And so that was one of the things that really drew me to this. When it comes to aspects of learning, like with anything else, you're going to be pretty much at the mercy of your teacher. If they like, the chabang, you're going to be learning chabang. If they like, disa, you're going to be learning knife. You're going to, it really depends on, and then, it's up to the student to say, hey, I'm interested in learning this. Can you show me that? And my teachers and myself, I try to keep this very practical aspect. I don't like to teach things that you're not going to have, right? If the style called for, it doesn't, but whip, right? And you say, look, teach me to whip. I'll be like, well, I'll teach you to whip. I'll teach you the whip form, but are you really going to carry a whip with you in the street or so we try to be very practical in the weapons that we teach. I remember one time when you and I were talking about sarong, and my teacher was like, yeah, are you wearing a sarong? It's like, well, no. And he was like, well, okay, your belt. So your belt is your, so we try to be very practical with those aspects. And so with that, you may have to adapt, certain, things to fit the modern day, for lack of not to sound quaint, the modern day warrior. He certainly, and I think that I certainly think that when we get together and we do workshops, we could do more weapons. But I think that the reason why we don't is because there are so many people that have never seen this art, that struggle with just the basic mechanics of this art. That's where the emphasis is. And so they like to graduate. We like to graduate that. So when you can move and understand the basic principles, then we can put the weapon in your hand. So you can understand, now you know how to move and you can utilize that. So I think that, although I think that we could do more of that, I think that is that's the answer or the reason why that we don't do that. Because if you have never seen this art before and you see the jurus, you're like, you'd be hard pressed to be like, I've shown them the people and they're like, I couldn't see anything. I have no idea what you're doing. Which was my experience too. I was like, I don't understand these things. And I was a martial artist for many years. And if you can't understand it by looking at it, you're going to be confounded when you try to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons. I always tell my students, if you want to experiment with your, pick up a practice karamba, and utilize. Make sure you pick up a practice one, utilize, and see, and then I'll show you, how to make it more practical and use it, because you can use, anything as your weapon, as you can pick up anything on the street and use that.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that definitely it is a different reference for me than perhaps for some coming into this art, because I spend so much time in a weapons training or weapons oriented art. So when we are doing this, I definitely have a lot of internal concept around the properties and qualities of different weapon categories and how I might apply things that I'm doing from SILAT with those different weapons or in those different contexts. So I count that fortunate, and fortunate even for some of the guys who are training with me, who get to do SILAT with you, because in their mind they're like, oh, okay, well, I understand that this is where the weapon would be in relation to me and you. This is where I need to keep blade orientation and things like that. And so that's good fortune for that person who has that already internal reference to count on.
I think one of the most I should say fun and eye-opening and disturbing things is when I learned that you could do puta kapala with a knife. I was like, oh man, that's amazing and gory. And wow, if I did that, you'd be covered with blood. But that the movements are designed to do that. They're so you could utilize your weapons with those. But when you're doing that, you have that realization. You're like, yeah, I'm going to be cutting this artery as I do this. So it's one of those things where you actually, when you get into it, you can actually see more of the applications of the weapons when you do it.
Right on, right on. Well, let me say a couple of things to people, just like on the general note, and then maybe I'll give you a moment to say any kind of like last closing things before we go. So definitely want to say thank you for anybody who was able to jump on today, and obviously you'll be able to go back and look at this. I just feel like it was super informative for me, and there's so many aspects where in any of these martial arts, whether it's in the wide array of Filipino martial arts, the wide array of Indonesian martial arts, the wide array of martial arts from all over the world, that we have a tendency sometimes to put them in this small bucket and assume that they are all alike, when in truth there's just a huge variety, and a huge variety in the way of thinking and conceptualizing and philosophies and ideologies around them. So this was really fortunate for me as well, and just to hear from you guys. Know that I'm kind of continuing to do this project. So sometimes it'll be weekly, sometimes it'll be bi-weekly. I'm trying to bring people in of different styles, of different arts, so that we get the opportunity to hear what they have to say, to show kind of mutual appreciation, to express a level of camaraderie between different martial arts and between different teachers, to really express profound thanks and gratitude, because they're out there kind of maintaining a lot of these arts. They're maintaining the cultures that they come from. And so this is a really nice opportunity to do that. I'm continuing to teach, so make sure you reach out if you have any questions about that. I put on the banner down there below my Patreon account, where I have some tutorial stuff around some Filipino martial arts, but also around some capoeira, which is something that I'm very invested in sharing, both as a martial art and as a cultural practice. So hopefully you'll reach out to me regarding that and any questions you have there. And then also make sure that you look up Kuno Martial Arts, and on there you'll be able to access Guru Robert. I didn't make a banner for your email on here, which was my fault, but I know that they can contact you through Kuno Martial Arts.
Yep.
And that has all of his contact information, or you can reach out to me directly and I can give you his contact info as well, because he's teaching here in New York City. And so that's a great opportunity. Be prepared to dive deep. Like, they're 3-hour classes, they're They're into very finite details and like really delving deep into those things, which for a person like me who likes to nerd out on some martial arts, I love that. For some people who just saw the raid and they're like, yo, when do I get to do the backflip and the neck break? You might be disappointed. But this is, it's a great opportunity. So Guru Robert, is there anything that you want to say just to kind of close this out before we go anywhere?
Just terima kasih. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. And if they have any questions and they want to speak to me offline, certainly can reach me through Kuno, or you can pass the information. They can reach out to you and pass the information to me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of my knowledge.
Definitely. Okay, terima kasih. All right, and I will see you soon, Robert. Thank you so much.
All right.